Okay, chapter 15 is going to be on mutualism and commensalism. So looking at different relationships that either plus plus or plus zero. The key concepts are that in positive interactions, no species is harmed, and the benefits are greater than the costs for at least one of the species. So there's at least one person's gaining benefit, maybe both are. Each partner in a mutualistic interaction acts in ways that serve its own ecological and evolutionary interests. So the environment is not altruistic. Unless there is a direct benefit, organisms are not going to exchange willingly in interaction. And positive interactions affect the abundance and distribution of populations as well as the structure of ecological communities. So this is an example of these fungus farming ants that have been using fungi for their food for at least 50 million years, which is pretty crazy. And so in this example, so the leafcutter ants cut off bits of the leaves from plants and feed them to a fungi, and they strip off the wax layer so the fungus can actually the fungi can get into the sort of juicy inner bits. And so they are providing food to the fungi, processing that food, getting it ready for the fungi, and then in turn, the ants are consuming the fungi. Pretty amazing how big these things are. I mean, not the ants themselves, but these colonies. These are where the fungus is grown, or the fungi is grown, and they're about the size of footballs. And here's one here. The ants coming in and out, feeding leaves to the fungi. Pretty amazing. So saying ants scrape the waxy coating, covering the leaves so the fungi can penetrate, and then the fungus then detoxifies the chemicals in the plant that deter insect herbivores. And so the ants can't eat the leaf directly because the plant has adapted to herbivory and is producing secondary compounds, i.e. toxins, that deter herbivores. And so the ants will deliver the food to the fungi detoxify it, so then the ants can consume the fungi. And then the ants protect the fungi by just destroying other non-targeted fungi and pathogens, etc. So positive interactions are where one or both species benefit, and neither are harmed. So one individual might not benefit, but it's not costing that organism anything. There's some people who debate this, that there is no such thing as a net zero interaction, meaning in like the nursery tree example we'll look at, there's some negative impact to that nursery tree, but for our purposes we'll pretend that there's not. And so most plants form associations with fungi. Early vascular plants lack true roots, and fungi help them colonize land. These positive interactions influence key events in the life history and continue to shape communities and influence ecosystem functions. So we'll look at facilitation, and facilitation can be broken into two things: mutualism and commensalism. Mutualism is mutually beneficial interaction between two individual species, or individuals of two species. So plus, meaning they're both getting something out of it. And commensalism is individuals of one species benefit, and individuals of the other species do not benefit or are not harmed. And so again, there's some debate around commensalism, whether or not, I've got a couple of examples of commensalism that would count as a plus zero. Others, you could invoke mechanisms where the zero organism is actually harmed. So symbiosis is two species that live in close physical contact to one another. For example, pea aphids and their bacterial symbionts. Humans and the bacteria live in our gut. Symbiosis can include parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. So not all symbiosis is facilitation. Some symbiosis counts as facilitation, as in commensalism and mutualism, but you can have parasitic symbionts as well. And the benefits of positive interactions may take many forms: food, shelter, transport, etc. Food and shelter are some common ones. Transport we'll look at as it relates to seed dispersal. And there we have to think about what's the benefit to the individuals being dispersed. And there has to be some benefit to dispersal. In mutualism, there's a cost to one or both partners, but the net effect is positive. And for each species, the benefits are greater than the costs. And so this is saying that there is no free lunch, but the benefit you're getting from that outweighs the cost. We'll kind of delve in that into a few specific examples. And mutualistic associations are everywhere. Plants form mycorrhizae, and mycorrhizae is extremely widespread. There's symbiotic associations between the roots and various fungi. The fungi increase the surface area and uptake of water and nutrients, and the plants supply the fungi with carbohydrates. The fungi improve plant growth and survival in a wide range of habitats. Let me get that exact number here. And really, mycorrhizae fungi can be used to explain most of the plant distributions we see. There's been numerous studies where they apply a fungicide, and then plants quickly perish. And so these mycorrhizal fungi are really one of the biggest, most important drivers for plant communities that's frequently not fully recognized. And so 80% of angiosperms, i.e. flowering plants, and all gymnosperms, conifers, etc., have mycorrhizal associations. And so that's one. There's been studies of replanting trees, and if they don't bring some of the old soil that has the mycorrhizal fungi, or they treat the tree with with an antifungal compound, and then move that tree, it almost immediately dies. That they really do need these associations with mycorrhizal fungi. So it's pretty interesting. This is a map showing the distribution of mycorrhizal fungi associations, which you can see it covers pretty much everywhere that plants exist. So it's extremely important. They don't include Antarctica in there, but we can assume there's not a whole lot of mycorrhizal fungi in Antarctica. There's two main types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's ectomycorrhizae. And this is a fungus that grows between the root cells and forms a mantle around the root. We'll look at an image that kind of explains this a little bit better, because they both kind of do the same thing, but the big difference is in the arbuscular mycorrhizae, that the fungus penetrates the cell walls of some of the root cells, forming a branch network called an arbuscule. So arb like tree, arbuscule. So they both can go in between the root cells, but arbuscular mycorrhizae are the only ones that penetrate the cell walls. So this diagram shows it quite nicely, where you can see the mycorrhizal fungi here in the ectomycorrhizae. And so you can think ecto is outside, but in fact they are sort of on the inside as well, right? But they're not penetrating the cell wall. So you can see the mycorrhizal fungi going around various root cells, but they're not piercing the cell wall here, compared to arbuscular mycorrhizae, which are doing the same thing. They're forming around the cells, but in some instances they're penetrating within the cell. So the big difference here is penetration of the cell wall. If the mycorrhizae fungi are breaking into the cell wall, then it's an arbuscular mycorrhizae, compared to an ectomycorrhizae, which may be within the root itself, right? But it's not penetrating the cell wall. It's forming in between the cell walls to help deliver water and nutrients and then receive carbohydrates. Because again, this is a mutualistic relationship. So the mycorrhizal fungi need to get something out of the relationship as well. So they're not just being nice fungi and delivering free lunches to the plant. They're also getting typically nutrition via carbohydrates through it, but they're expanding the network for which plants can absorb things like nitrogen and phosphorus as well as water. And so that's really a function of surface area, right? And so these fungi are really thin and can extend out for a long way and extend the network for which the plant's able to get vital nutrients it needs. Nutrients would be including water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and in exchange the fungus is getting some food via carbohydrates. Corals famously have mutualisms with symbiotic algae. Zooxanthellae is the primary one. And so the coral provides the algae with a home and nutrients and access to sunlight. And in exchange, the algae gives the coral some of that photosynthetic byproduct, some of those carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis. So when we talk about coral bleaching events, that's primarily the coral being stressed and no longer being able to support the zooxanthellae, their symbiotic algae, and so they eject those algae, which is a major cost to the coral because now they've lost a major component of their nutritional portfolio. Corals can also consume. They're effectively sea anemones, right? So they can also consume floating particles that come by. However, a major part of their diet, or their nutrition rather, comes from zooxanthellae, from their symbiotic algae. So you can think of like that tipping point of when they're no longer able to support the zooxanthellae as a coral bleaching event, when the costs outweigh the benefits. Herbivores such as cattle and sheep depend on bacteria and protists that live in their guts to metabolize cellulose, and so when we're looking, same thing with wood-eating insects like the, I don't have many up here, what are they called? Termites. We'll look at a wood roach, which is kind of disgusting looking, but these are really complex structures that most animals can't break down. But with the help of bacteria or protists, they can break down those complex structures, cellulose, and then derive some nutrition from that. So here's this wood-eating cockroach, kind of a disgusting-looking little critter, and this is a protist that lives within their gut that breaks down cellulose, and so there's a mutualistic benefit here where the protist has a nice home in the gut of a wood-eating insect like this cockroach or a termite. In exchange, it's breaking down complex things like cellulose that the either cockroach or wood-eating cockroach or termite will not be able to eat on its own. So it's really opening up a whole new food source for the host, and then for the protist, it's got a great place to live and a steady supply of food. And so commensalism is a +0 relationship. And some examples of that are lichens on trees, where having a lichen on a tree is perhaps not costing the tree anything. It's usually in a shaded area. It's not impacting photosynthesis. It's just kind of hanging out there. Bacteria on our skin. So supposedly there's no negative impact to us from these bacteria, but they're living there. And then in this idea of kelp forest, we're really thinking of a foundational species. So kelp is there providing a three-dimensional habitat that's greatly increasing biodiversity and biomass, and the organisms that are benefiting from that are not necessarily benefiting the kelp itself. And so they're benefiting from being in a kelp forest, but the kelp itself might not be benefiting. Same thing can be thought of in forest systems. Insects and understory plants depend on the overstory, the trees, whether it be here in a temperate region or in tropical areas, but perhaps there's no benefit to those trees themselves. And positive interactions are highly species specific and often obligate, meaning that they only occur together, and if that interaction is lost, then both of those organisms cannot survive. So a leafcutter ant being an example of an obligate interaction. More specifically, an obligate mutualistic interaction where both species are benefiting. So the leafcutter ant doesn't have the fungus, it can't survive, and the fungus only exists with the leafcutter ant. So without leafcutter ants, that fungus cannot survive. And so in that case, it's an obligate interaction. Many mutualisms and commensalisms are facultative, and they show few signs of coevolution, meaning that you can trade out the species and you still have the same interaction. So in deserts, the shade of an adult plant creates cooler moisture conditions, and seeds of plants can only germinate in the shade. So this adult's called a nursery plant. But the seeds that germinate under various species of plants. So they're not specific to a certain type of plant. It's really just the structure that a large plant's providing, shade, a little cooler environment. Now, you can think of that as a commensal relationship where the large tree or plant that's providing that shade is not being hurt by all the other plants growing underneath it. You could also argue that there's a cost, meaning having a bunch of plants grow under you, you're competing for water and nutrients as well. And so here they're considering that a commensal relationship where clearly the understory plants, the plants that are the individuals in the nursery situation are getting benefit. It's cooler, moisture, there's shade, so they're able to grow in those conditions. If that tree was not there, they would not be able to grow. So they're clearly driving a positive benefit. And they're making the argument that the tree is getting a net zero benefit. They're not getting it's not costing them anything, or they're not getting any benefit by those plants growing in their shade. I think you can make a strong argument that there is a negative relationship there, that having understory plants could be robbing water and nutrients, or perhaps there could be the converse, which is then those plants are helping with soil erosion or something like that, where they're helping keeping the soil more constant. So perhaps think of this relationship between a nursery tree and the plants growing under it, under both a mutualistic relationship where those understory plants could be holding in the soil, preventing erosion. Maybe it's commensal, where there's no cost to that tree, or maybe there is a cost where those organisms, those understory plants, are robbing water and nutrients from that nursery tree. And they could potentially also eventually grow up and out-compete that nursery tree. That's also pretty common in forest systems. And so think of like those kind of three different ways of interaction for a nursery tree and the understory plants. Large herbivores such as deer or moose consume the seeds of herbaceous plants. Many of these seeds pass unharmed and are deposited as feces. Thus, feces becomes the dispersal mechanism. And plants may benefit by having their seeds dispersed, and herbivores benefit from the source of food. And so this gets at, you would think that herbivory is a cost, but many plants put a ton of energy into producing tasty morsels with the intention of somebody coming by to eat them and then dispersing their seeds. And so there's clearly a cost to the plant to produce these tasty morsels, and there's clearly a benefit from the herbivore because they get a tasty morsel. But then the question is, does the benefit to the plant outweigh the cost? Does the benefit to dispersal outweigh the cost of having to produce these nutrient-rich, often sugar-rich seeds, berries, nuts, etc.? And so there's clearly a benefit, otherwise that the plants wouldn't be doing it. And the plants need to disperse. And so this dotted line is the distance that ants can disperse seeds. And then everything to the right of that line is the dispersal distance by deer. And distance in meters, so up to almost 4 kilometers, which is pretty good. So this is dispersal via white-tailed deer of the understory plant Trillium, and so there's clearly a benefit for the plant. If it did not have this form of dispersal, it would likely only be able to disperse a few meters, and then it would not be able to colonize new areas or really engage in like a larger meta population. You just have these little isolated populations that could go extinct due to local factors. And so being able to disperse one's seeds is quite important. And so the plants are putting a ton of energy into that. It's a massive cost, as well as the cost of being directly consumed. But there's a benefit in their dispersal. And so they're in that case, it becomes a positive benefit. So we can think about these interactions by the outcome of each species. It can be positive, negative, or neutral. In a positive relationship, the benefits outweigh the costs. And so the benefits of dispersal on an evolutionary scale outweigh the cost of producing flowers or seeds or things or berries that are going to be consumed. That's a positive benefit. You think about an apple, like that's a huge amount of energy produced. The goal is somebody will consume it and then disperse the seeds via fecal matter somewhere else. Or a negative benefit where the costs outweigh the benefits. Neutral, benefits and costs are equal. Again, people often kind of get into nuances and argue, well, maybe there's some negative impact here or there. But costs and benefits can vary in space and time. And so relationships that may be positive in one instance may become negative in another instance. And so we can look at this relationship between cattails and which is Typha, and myostis, which was a shoot, I forget the name of that plant. Let me look it up real quick. I think it was a was it a small flowers? Oh, forget me not. Okay. So this relationship between whether or not these plants are commensal or competitors depends on temperature and oxygen level as a covariate to temperature. And so as temperatures increase, oxygen levels go down, and when temperatures are warmer, oxygen levels go. When temperatures are warmer, oxygen goes down. When temperatures are cooler, oxygen goes up. Temperature and oxygen are inversely related based on the solubility of oxygen in water, which is true for most solubility equations. So we can look at various biomass measurements, root length, root biomass, and shoot mass, and see that for the forget-me-not, when it's grown with cattails and grown without cattails. So the forget-me-not does better when it's grown with cattails at cooler temperatures, and the forget-me-not does worse when it's grown with cattails at warmer temperatures. And so at high temperatures, the cattail decreases the growth and has a negative impact. And when temperatures are lower, the cattail has a benefit. So it depends on the conditions, and so we have to think about one, like over an annual scale, what that benefit looks like, versus kind of snapshots as well. In assessing the importance of positive interactions, ecologists looked at neighboring plants from 115 different species in 11 regions. And the performance of the target species with and without neighbors present was measured as a change in biomass and leaf number. And so this is looking at nearest neighbor distance. And so relative nearest neighbor, R in E, is defined as the growth of the target species when neighboring plants are present, minus the growth when neighbors are removed. Of alpine plants was measured in plots in high and low elevations, and plant growth was measured by a change in biomass or leaf number. REN values greater than 0 indicate that neighbors increase growth, and REN values less than 0 indicate that neighbors decreased growth. And so here we're looking at different locations, both high and low elevation. And here the REN, the relative nearest neighbor, was generally positive at high elevation sites and generally negative at low elevation sites. So we can look at, these are different plant communities, and here in high elevations, having a higher REN value increased growth, meaning you grew better when you were closer to your neighbors, and then at low elevations there was a negative impact to being closer to your to your neighbors. And so here's an example of the same plant at different elevations having different interactions. And so there's a benefit to being at higher densities at high elevation, and at low elevations there's generally a cost to that. And so the relative nearest neighbor was negatively related to the maximum summer temperatures, and this suggests that positive interactions were common in colder, more stressful environments, and competition was more common in warmer, less stressful environments. Another thing we can think about, is there another way to explain this pattern? Meaning, it's effectively saying in high elevations for a given species, you would have patches that are more dense, and there's a benefit to that. Or rather, positive growth is associated with being in a patch at high elevations. In lower elevations, there's less there's less growth associated with high density. So at lower elevations, competition is a bigger driving factor. At higher elevations, being in a high density environment is not a negative. There's in fact there's a correlation with positive growth. Now to think about what these interactions mean, or like what is the mechanism here, I think you could derive a secondary hypothesis, which is that in high elevation that the suitable patches are typically smaller. You could think about, the top of like heather meadows, like of a Mount Baker. The patches at which this organism can survive are much smaller, and so therefore you're going to have a higher density of that plant in that area, because the suitable habitat patches are very small. So here we're looking at a habitat limited situation, and so those plants are going to occur in high densities compared to lower elevations where there's more suitable habitat, and so competition will start to outweigh it. So it could be a relationship to habitat suitability, and if we think about limiting resources and the distribution of organisms, we're likely to have a patchy distribution when resources are limited. So if habitat is a limiting factor, and there's only small patches of habitat that plant can survive in, it's going to be more densely packed because it's following a patchy distribution. Where at lower elevations, now light is a limiting factor, and so you're going to expect a more even distribution. And so by definition, with an even distribution, you would start to have a greater distance between individuals. So it could be a relationship to what's the limiting factor for growth. And at high elevations, that limiting factor for growth is likely habitat space. And at lower elevations where there's abundant habitat, then the limitation becomes light. So that could be what we're seeing. And they're kind of defining it here as positive and negative interactions. But you could also argue that it's really just a change in the limitation for growth. And at high elevations, that limitation for growth being suitable habitat. So we're going to have a patchy distribution. When you have a patchy distribution, you have a bunch of organisms in one small space. At lower elevation, if light's limiting, then you're more likely to see an even distribution and more distance between two individuals, which would relate to in this case, a more negative RNE, relative nearest neighbor. They're going to be further apart in an alpine situation where habitat's limiting. you're going to have a higher RNE, relative nearest neighbor, because they're all going to be patched in together. So that could also explain that pattern. And so it's important to think about mechanisms versus observation. And so the observation is that median summer temperature is associated with a decrease in relative neighbor index, which is a decrease in relative neighbor index means that they're further apart. With colder summer temperatures, they're packed in more tightly. So it's two different ways of thinking about that observation of increased relative neighbor index at high elevation and decreased relative neighbor index at low elevations. The mechanism could be a change in what's limiting. So at alpine, the limitation would be habitat, and at lower levels, the limitation would be light. Okay, I'll stop here and move on to the probably 2 more lectures.